If you want to make your own podcast but feel intimidated by the tech barriers, then you might need Alitu. Alitu is a web app that lets you create and publish great sounding podcast episodes. It takes care of the complicated stuff, leaving you free to concentrate on what you do best, talking about your passion. Alitu, the podcast maker app, find it at alitu.com. That's ALITU.com.
Hey everybody, this is the What School Could Be in Hawaii podcast. I'm your host, Josh Rappoon. This is another On the Road episode, and today we're with Dr. Helen Turner, who's the Vice President for Strategy and Innovation at Chaminade University in Honolulu, Hawaii. Welcome to the show, Dr. Turner.
Thanks for inviting me, Josh.
Should I call you Dr. Turner, or for the bulk of this, may I call you Helen?
I think we're friends. Let's go with Helen.
All right, let's go with Helen. Okay, so the format that I came up with today, I'm just going to call it 10 questions with Helen Turner. And I came up with these 10 questions while doing a bit of research into you and into your resume. And so we'll just roll through a set of questions, and then we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back and roll through the rest of them.
Sure, sounds interesting.
Okay. All right. So question number one. So you are a professor of biology with a lengthy resume of study and action in the fields of cell biology, immunology, and more. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what crazy, complex, even scary biology questions are keeping you awake at night?
Well, that's a good question. Oh, my goodness. So I have had, to reflect a little on the CRISPR-Cas, the gene editing that was done in China. The fact that I think we may be naive if we think that that's not already happening in a lot of places. I read one report where when they were looking at the guy's emails, who was the researcher in China, they found a whole bunch of approaches from fertility clinics all over the world, actually, right? So, so it's out there, right? And in a sense, no question that there should have been consequences for that researcher for what he did, but driving that kind of research underground, that actually scares me as much as the technology itself. So I'm a little worried about the that kind of gene editing and where that's going to take us and what's going on out there, really probably without a lot of monitoring.
For our listeners out there, especially educators who might be in the STEM field, what is CRISPR? I'm a big fan of a podcast called Radiolab, and they've been doing a series of podcasts about CRISPR, so I'm familiar with it.
So this is a gene editing technology that, on the upside has the potential to eradicate diseases and make the world a better place in many, many places, is already powering an enormous amount of biomedical research that's being done in the lab, in cell lines, in animal models. But it is a germ line, which means it edits unto the generations. So if you do this to a human embryo, then the human embryo's children, their children's children, everyone is altered from that moment onwards. And we've never had that capacity, at least not in the scientific sense. And it really, our generation is going to have to confront eugenics the same way that the generation around the Second World War had to confront it, right? And so I don't know if we're prepped for that. I worry whether we're ready.
Okay.
So that's one thing that worries me. Looming antibiotic resistance. I get worried about that a lot.
Yikes, I'm getting more worried by the minute here.
Yeah, you should be, right? I mean, what are we going to do if we run out of ways to kill diseases? 1 in 5 deaths worldwide now is from sepsis, which is blood poisoning. I mean, that to me, that would be a statistic I would not have been surprised to see when I'm teaching my historical public health class about how bad it was back before we had antibiotics. That's a very worrying trend, and it either means that people aren't getting care or that the drugs are stopping working when we deal with bacterial, fungal, viral infections, and so on. So that's worrying me a little bit. Obviously, I could go on, but I think one other thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently with what's been happening in Australia is, and it's not something that's kind of within my field as a cell biologist, but it's bigger picture stuff around climate change. You know, the fact that we've talked for so many years about a 100-year horizon for climate change and how over the next century, you know, the temperatures are going to rise, and we presented it in a way, or it's been presented as this gradual far off thing. And the fact that it's here now and right in the faces of so many people on Earth, I think we're sort of losing, we haven't quite grasped that somehow, and it's getting ever more difficult, obviously, to make the arguments given the political climate. But yeah, that sort of immediacy in the here and now of climate change is something that I've been thinking about a lot. It's kind of a first world thing, but I read an article saying that ski resorts in Europe are closing all the time. You know, there's just no snow anymore. The ski season in Europe is 38 days shorter than it was when I first went on my first school ski trip in 1983. And, you know, that is an economic issue. But it's also something that I'm just feeling that the people aren't trading with all this stuff that's happening here and now. And then when the fires in Australia started to happen, you know, what's happening with Everest bursting into bloom. I mean, these things are incredible, and they're right now. And so those are the things that keep me awake at night.
Tell me a little bit more about this course that you mentioned, this historical, what was the name of the course?
Oh, well, I teach at Chaminade. I teach epidemiology, public health. Most recently, I started doing that actually in our data science program, which is about data analytics and how healthcare analytics can really, you know, hopefully help society. But for a long time, I've taught public health, and I start that course historically, going back to the earliest days of public health, theories of disease that people had in ancient times, theories of disease that sort of moved through the Enlightenment, you know, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and eventually into kind of the modern era. And one of the things that I do is look at how, you know, what did people die of back in the day, right? And then what do they die of today? And then that prompts a whole discussion with students, which is really powerful, actually, about and what are we spending money on trying to cure? You know, because there's a dichotomy there, right? You know, we spend the most money on diseases that, you know, are diseases that are concerned to us here in the West. What most people on Earth die of and not those diseases, you know. So we talk a lot about very early introduction to the students into how money, healthcare, science, how there's a link between those three things.
Got it. Okay, so question number 2.
Okay.
So you are the Vice President for Strategy and Innovation at Chaminade University, which is a private university here in Honolulu, Hawaii. In the past 3 years, you've established an in-house incubator and think tank at Chaminade, and an in-house innovation incubator for faculty, alumni, and community partner projects. So the question is, what innovations are you seeing emerge from these incubators and think tanks so far?
We're seeing some really interesting ideas and actually projects that are close to fruition for after the first sort of year or so of trying to do this. So the background to this position is really, I mean, if I had to describe it, I'd say, you know, in a way I get to take credit for all the really cool stuff that a lot of people are already doing at Chaminade. But Chaminade is a small private institution. It is up on the hill. It is a, you know, beautiful, quiet campus, has not necessarily the place that you'd immediately look at and say, well, I wonder who's innovating around here. But, you know, we have a mission of serving the underserved, and we have a lot of need to be creative because our mission of serving people who can't necessarily afford a really expensive private education means that we have to learn to run smart and run lean and all those kinds of things. So one of the first things I did when I was asked to be in this position is take a look around, kind of do an audit, do a survey, and look for what's going on the campus. And I thought, you know, that I would find a baseline from which I could then grow innovation. And what I found is talent, creativity, ideas, innovations, a lot of really important energy, but with, you know, faculty and staff who don't have a lot of bandwidth, might not have a lot of experience in going out there to get grant funding, say, to fund their ideas. And I thought, okay, here's something that we can work with. So we're basically doing two sort of main thrusts in the innovation area. One is taking projects that the faculty and staff want to get funded, want to advance. Some very interesting things that are going on there. We have a faculty, Dr. Jungwa Su. She's working on a kind of augmented reality syllabus. So this would interest, I think, your
I'm now super curious.
Yeah,
yes.
so looking at the syllabus, she's an interior design faculty member, and she's just looking at the syllabus through the lens of graphics and color and engagement and inclusion, and a syllabus that's so much more than just a sort of a dry list of here's the learning outcomes and here's what you're going to be doing every week. And that also is very inclusive and, as we say a lot at Chaminade, students first, student focused, because it really tells the student, respects the student's need to manage their time, budget their time, figure out where in the whole arc of the class they need to be putting the most energy. And we're working to get something basically coded that could turn that into a platform, turn it into a way where faculty could see each other's syllabi. And we could, maybe not give the students quite such a hard week in week 5 when everybody schedules their exams and things like that.
Right.
So I think that's an example of just incredibly creative faculty, incredibly talented, and the incubator's really there just to help her move that project forward and hopefully get some support for it and develop a prototype. Another area that we're really interested in is a sort of social incubator function. So we put out an invitation to the Chaminade community, which is, our faculty, our staff, our alums, and our partners in the community, and said, okay, one of the things that Hawaii has done really well is really start moving towards an innovation economy. There's a lot of business incubators out there, a lot of tech incubators. But what if what you want to do is primarily social? Or what if what you want to do might not have an immediately obvious bottom line, but that we could maybe develop into something. So a couple projects that we're really excited there, working with a former student of Chaminade, an alum called John Iwohi. And John is one of our Ho'ulu Native Hawaiian STEM scholars. And he was a homeless person for many years of his life. And he came to Chaminade on a scholarship, got a degree in nursing, and is now doing a doctorate of nursing practice at University of Hawaii at Hilo in their wonderful program over there.
Wow.
And he's working at Institute for Human Services here in Hawaii. And he came to see me and said, I got this idea, but I don't know how to move it forward. And his idea is, how can we develop a tech platform that is a legal document repository for homeless persons, right? That works. And of course, in this era of blockchain and biometrics, there are ways to kind of conceive that. And so again, we're helping him develop a prototype. But we also then have projects that are not going to turn into a product per se. One of our faculty at Chaminade is extremely interested in higher education pathways for developmentally disabled persons, and we don't have that really here in Hawaii. And I think what will come out of her project that we're sort of incubating is it's a white paper or a policy document or a call to action. Mm-hmm. And so we're okay with that being the type of product, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is a really interesting area for us, and we're kind of doing it on fumes, and seeing how we can deploy limited resources to really help some of these projects take off. But we have projects in data visualization. We've got 2 alums who want to be the Uber of textbooks. They want to disrupt the textbook industry because they think it is unjust.
Please
right?
do. Yes.
Yeah. A lot of people are cheering on the other end. So,
I'm cheering.
We have a healthcare entrepreneur who wants to provide a caregiving curriculum for women who are in the home and are being care providers, but have, in aging society, don't have a lot of, training in that and support. And so that's a really interesting partnership. I could go on, but really, really exciting and such amazing energy and creativity in such a small school, right?
So clearly you've got results coming already, and that's really, really remarkable.
We're starting to see, one of the things we decided to do as a kind of sort of a operating principle is that we wanted to respect and understand that people have very limited bandwidth, either as a faculty member, but if you're an alum who's just starting their career out and maybe working 2 or 3 jobs, as so many people do here in Hawaii, if you are working, as a staff member or so on. And so a lot of incubators, they have that. You got 1 year, you're in a cohort and you're done. And, TBD to see how this plays out, but we have basically said, we understand it's going to take time. My team's role is to facilitate and start a document, start a PowerPoint, help get the meetings together and move these things forward. But it's really trying to respect the fact that all of these people have vocations and jobs that they're living out, as well as trying to incubate this idea that they have. So we'll see. I'll come back in a couple of years and tell you whether we got anywhere with it.
I think one of the things that you said was that the audit that you did, what you uncovered were inspirations and innovations all across the campus.
Yeah.
And I think that's very special when you come at it that way. You're honoring what people are already doing in terms of creativity and imagination and innovation. That's very, very cool.
And a lot of these incubators, we wanted not to be a Shark Tank. Because there's such wastage in that system where, you have a limited number of slots and people, have to compete for them. But then what happens to the other guys, right? And especially, again, thinking about people's bandwidth and the many, many commitments they have living in Hawaii. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out. We tried to cast a very wide net, and maybe what we'll find is that we're a little naive about that. But I don't know. I'm happy to be in that place right now, and I'm just excited about the projects.
That's very cool. So listeners, we're in the middle of 10 questions for Helen Turner, and now we're going to turn to question number 3. So question number 3 is, your Chaminade Board of Regents named an endowed fund, the Helen C. Turner, or Dr. Helen C. Turner Endowed Fund for Excellence in the Sciences. So the question is, what is excellence in science, and why do we need it?
So I think that, why we need excellence in science is because it, done right, science can move our world forward, and it can advance social justice, and it can enrich the human condition, and it can save lives, and all of that stuff, right? And I think if you had asked young Helen that question, what does excellence look like? I would have quoted a guy who I met once who worked at NIH, National Institutes of Health, called Henry Metzger. He's a very senior professor when I was a very junior professor. And he said in the front of an annual review of immunology, which is my field, he put this quote one year, and he said, in science, the excellent is not just better than the ordinary, it's all that matters, right? And so, if you'd asked young Helen, she would have said, well, it's what grants you get, it's what papers you publish, it's what journals you publish in, what are their impact factors. And, 10 years at Chaminade Helen, 20 years in Hawaii Helen says that what is excellent science is science that represents diverse people's viewpoints, that makes sure that the science is done by and done for and done to people who are included in all of the decision making. And I think that's sort of, I came up in a time when the model for at least the kind of science that we do is, one person in a lab coat, usually a male, runs a lab, tells you what to do, and, a lot of egos in it. and I feel like a lot of wastage. I often tell my graduate students of a story when I first moved as a young postdoc to Harvard. I was in a building on right next to Fenway Park Baseball Stadium. And in that building, on the floor we were on, there were 4 major Harvard investigators working, using taxpayers' money to work on the same enzyme. And the people in their labs were under instruction not to talk to the other labs. Right?
Wow.
Wow. And so, and coming from an English system where that would have been kind of antithetical, I was really shocked by that, and always have remained shocked by that, and interested in, who gets to say what science is done, and who gets to audit whether, all those millions of dollars are spent, promoting the careers of these individuals and working on the same protein. I don't know. So I think when I look at what makes really excellent science that I see these days. I think it's incredibly inclusive. I think when you see the papers that come out that really knock you back and you say, wow, that is a huge advance, it's done by these huge teams of a lot of people around the table, a lot of people sharing the ideas. It's not that sort of very top-down kind of hierarchical thing. I think good science is reproducible, right? I think for many, many years of my career, it's been perfectly okay to publish something that maybe nobody else in the world ever reads or deals with or tries to reproduce. And now the funding agencies are really emphasizing that the work be reproducible and that its value can be judged not just by how much hype it generates, but whether anybody could actually validate that finding.
Right.
I think that's really key.
Right.
So I think those kinds of things. I mean, I have a lot of other thoughts about, for the young scientists that we're training. I mean, I think what makes them great scientists and what's going to make the science they do really strong is their connection to community and their connection to the societal problems that we're all meant to be kind of facing. Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is, that's a perfect segue. I'm going to reverse the order of questions 4 and 5 because of what you just described about excellent science. So question number 5, which becomes question number 4, is in the past 4 years, you've secured $15.6 million in STEM scholarship funding from Kamehameha schools for Native Hawaiian students, something you called the Ho'oulu program. So the question is, what excites you about this program, and why are you leaning into it clearly so hard to go after that kind of funding?
Yeah. Well, I think it's all about who has a voice in what science gets done, and how science is incredibly weak if the only voices in it are of, one kind of dominant majority culture, right? So that's kind of where it came from. If you look at this whole move towards inclusiveness in science and diversity in science, there are a couple of drivers for it. From a more kind of cynical viewpoint, if you look at the book Rising Above the Gathering Storm, which was a national congressional report that came out several years ago now, and that basically says, pretty cynically, we need to include more minorities in science because there aren't enough people doing science and the competitiveness of the nation is going to suffer, right? And it makes the argument, that if you don't have US nationals, you can't do science in the national defense because they can't be cleared. And, so, okay, I'll take that, right? But I think, and for many years where you were sort of looking at trying to build programs that were inclusive in science and promoted diversity, the challenges with that came from primarily a kind of deficit narrative about minorities, low-income people whose initial privilege pretty much excluded them from the science endeavor, right? And it came really from that place of, I guess we have to have some more diverse people in science, right? Which is the whole sort of tone of that report. And then I think some smarter and better voices got involved in this debate and started looking at the idea of what weakens science is a lack of perspectives, right? Well, if you look at the number of drugs that have been approved since the 70s, where, they actually just either don't work or don't work as well in African Americans because they weren't tested, right? These kinds of things.
Wow.
There's a famous case right now, I think, of an Alzheimer's drug that just been prescribed to millions of people, but just out and out almost doesn't work in certain ethnic groups. I mean, these types of things, it's really, well, who was the voice in that? Who was the voice that decided not to enroll women into trials for heart disease? Things like these kinds of, historical almost injustices. And so I think that, if we, look now the last few years and what Kamehameha Schools was willing to recognize are really two things. One is that if Hawaiians are disenfranchised from the STEM endeavor, that's not good for Hawaii or for the Lahui. It's not good in terms of well-paying jobs. It's not good in terms of guiding futures that are, defined by, science, technology, business innovation, those kind of things. But also that science is the poorer if it doesn't have people in it who come from the value systems that we sort of broadly espouse, I think, here in Hawaii, but particularly in the Native Hawaiian community, and that, the world has a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples who are connected to the Aina, who have the ethical framework, collaborative framework. I mean, all of this is really sending this idea that the central idea of Ho'ulu, which is maybe if we include and embrace culture as part of the training of making a scientist, maybe we actually build a better scientist.
Wow.
And so that program, it's obviously very, very dear to my heart. It has amazing outcomes. I mean, we move the needle. 100% of the students in that program to date have graduated. The retention rate in it is about 97%. The retention rate of our university, first to second years for Native Hawaiians across all disciplines, is 90.6%, right?
Wow.
It's just that and a lot of the other ways that we've modified the curriculum and the way that the pedagogy that they've really been, again, students first and really focused on this idea of valuing diverse perspectives in science. Because, to some extent, a lot of science is technical, mathematical. Anyone can do that. You can probably get an AI to do it, right? But it's the ethics and the value system and that and the vision that you see of why you're doing the science. What is the problem in society that you're angry about that you want to fix? That's what makes great science, right? And that's what we really encourage the students to see. So that program has an amazing kind of cultural framework. It embraces Western and Hawaiian epistemologies. It's brave about confronting equivalences and false equivalences between those epistemologies. We always say that what we've tried to do is make the culture the cake, not the frosting, right? It's easy to sprinkle in a few things, right? But this is deeper than that. And I think that depth was really, Kamehameha schools saw it for what it could be, and they took a risk on us.
That's fantastic.
And I couldn't be more grateful for the support that they've given us and the lives that they've changed for these students. And many of them are actually staying here.
Right.
Interestingly, one of the things we wanted to do with the program was really honor affirmative decisions to stay home. Right. In the situation, I talked to a lot of my students, and a lot of them take heat when they decide to stay here in Hawaii for their, undergraduate education. And we felt at Chaminade for a long time that, an undergraduate education in Hawaii and then mainland for graduate school, but then maybe come back. I mean, there are pathways that could help sort of confront this sort of talent drain. And especially for the Ho'ulu scholars, being able to stay here and be honored for that, and then go and do internships and stuff on the mainland, but be connected here, stay close to hula, stay close to their community, stay close to church. I mean, all of these things, that's what the secret source of the student's success is, I think.
Right.
I'm not actually convinced it's
right.
It's keeping them connected, right?
Right. So we're going to switch a little bit here into pedagogy and into teaching. And so question number 5, which was question number 4, goes like this. So 4 years ago, you were a grant reviewer for a Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program. And so the question is, to the educator who might not be familiar with the concept, and I'm talking K-12 here as well as higher education, what does it mean to teach with primary sources, and what are the benefits to students?
That feels like ancient history. I'm surprised it was only 4 years ago. I think I did their grant reviews because to sort of pay back, because they'd funded us to have a teacher education grant at Chaminade. And so Library of Congress has this outreach program where we wrote a grant to offer a professional development for teachers in this idea of how do you teach with primary sources in STEM, and how do you specifically make those primary sources relevant to Hawaii? So, and the Pacific, right? And so, teaching with primary sources is, the Library of Congress wants to promote it because they're a damn big library and they got a lot of sources in them, right?
Right,
and
exactly.
so they want people to use that. So it's about going there and finding the newspaper, finding the map, finding that first diary of someone who was on a voyage or something like that, but really connect in the first person to a historical Primarily it's been used, I think, in humanities. And this was a little bit at the edge. How can you use this in science? And so we offered a teacher training workshop, and we ended up having to kind of morph it a little bit because it turns out it's not a lot of Pacific primary sources, Hawaii or Pacific primary sources in the Library of Congress. We were able to help them see that that was maybe a little bit of a gap. Most of what they had were things like diaries and written by whalers, missionary stuff. It was pretty hard to find anything that was kind of authentically and indigenously a primary source.
So that was eye-opening in and of
It was
itself.
kind of eye-opening, yeah. So what happened was the teachers, many of whom were from Hawaiian schools and charter schools here, they started bringing their own stuff in. And they brought artifacts from their family and developed annotated resource sets and lesson plans around them. They bought, we tapped into this wonderful resource at the University of Hawaii, which is the translations of the Hawaiian newspapers, right? And that's, I think Puake and Nogelmeyer was up at UH at the time, the Language Research Institute. Sorry, I can't remember the exact name, but yeah, this wonderful online resource they have. And so we were able to, I think, extend the definition of primary source in STEM, and what the teachers, I think, pedagogically, what they were doing with it was storytelling, and it was connection with the students. So the annotated resource sets, and I think the lesson plans would be, here's an artifact from me as your teacher. And that immediately, first of all, sets up a really interesting conversation about this, this fish hook, or this, just so many different things that they brought in, pieces of jewelry, I mean, all kinds of stuff.
Wow, that's extraordinary.
Photographs,
Right.
But also it connects me to you as a student, as a fellow traveler, and as a human being, and as I have a family too, right? And this is my story. And of course, we and people who listen to this podcast, they know that that's the connection that's important. And for students to be able to identify with the faculty or the teacher as a human that they're connected with, I thought that was one of the central messages of this whole primary source thing, was that in the end, I don't think it's about logging onto a website and requesting a resource from a big library in Washington, D.C. or wherever it is. I think it's about what people have in their homes and their hearts and their families. And it was very powerful. It was a fun program, actually. I worked a lot with Manawai Peters and Violet Harada. Violet is a longtime librarian, and she was, I think it was originally her idea to go after this grant. And it was a lot of fun. I'd like to do that again sometime.
Coming up on August 8th of this year, my family, the Rapun family, is going to celebrate 100 years in Hawaii. And the reason why we're able to decide on August 8th is because after a pretty exhaustive search, we finally found the ship's manifest that explained the arrival date and all of the passengers on board the ship. The family was escaping from the Russian Revolution. And so on August 8th, the ship had to record its arrival in Honolulu Harbor, 1920. And there were the names of my grandfather and grandmother and their two sons. And it's just, I hear you when you talk about how students can make a contribution to a greater whole when they bring the artifacts of their lives to the teaching of primary sources. Right. And that sounds really special that that kids were able to do that.
Yeah. And I think that importance of storytelling in any discipline, I mean, obviously many disciplines are way ahead of STEM in using that as a technique, but I think the telling of stories and having students engage with their stories and engage on, significant global and regional issues, but then that connectivity to how they have. I mean, we see a lot of students who early on in a course, they might want, let's say it's a course in cancer biology. Now, one way to teach cancer biology is to start off with DNA mutation and work your way up, right? And another way is to talk through with the students. So this affects everybody, right? And then the stories come, and that's not easy for the faculty. Yeah, that's a
right.
And you don't want to trigger people. You don't want to go into these sort of dark places, but helping the students connect to why we do what we do as scientists, I think is when we've tried those kind of techniques and approaches in the classroom, the outcomes, I would say, have been resoundingly positive, and students feel, that they're seen and heard.
I taught history for 17 years at the high school level, and almost exclusively with primary sources from the very beginning. One of my favorite books of all time, David Horowitz's book called Blue Latitudes, where he tackles the question of what actually happened at Kealakekua Bay when Captain Cook died. And so the central anthropological question was he attacked or did he attack? And so what Horowitz does is he, using all of the available data and primary sources and a lot of science, travels the entire length of Cook's journeys around the Pacific, all the while gathering the data that he needed to ultimately come to his own conclusion about what actually happened. And for me, that's very inspiring as a teacher to think that my kids would be on a similar journey. They work their way through the sources and then they come to a conclusion. And of course, there are variances to that. You can come to some very wrong conclusions, but still the journey is the really important part when you do that.
And in coming to that conclusion, if the conclusion is challenged, it means that they have to back it up.
Right.
Right. That's an evidence-based approach, right? And I think when, we're so beset by pseudoscience and this, there's no longer any such thing as a fact, apparently, this kind of stuff,
boy.
right?
Yeah.
That, that generating young people who not only think critically about what they're being told, but have lived that experience of having to try and back something up with some evidence, and not in a combative, not in a, negative sort of way, but that sort of figuring out how to do that challenge is an important part of students owning their own inquiry.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And when we talk about resilience and grit and determination, we're talking about reaching those challenges or responding to those challenges.
Yeah.
That's an important part of growing as a person.
Yeah. I'm glad that I've lived through the time educationally when we move away from this sort of, let's not challenge the students too much kind of, mentality to, no, let's respectfully, let's go to the mat with them and see, what their ideas are made of. So that, I feel that was something that really was almost directly or indirectly kept a lot of people down, right? This idea of you're a student who is, from a low income group or whatever, we're just gonna, just pat you on the head and thanks for coming to our program kind of stuff,
Right.
And that, really that move from, especially in representation and inclusion in STEM, the move away from just checking the boxes and saying, okay, we have a certain number of this, and this type of student, to asking, are they actually successful?
Yeah.
That's what those kind of pedagogical approaches it gives you. Moves, access you can do just with money. Success, that takes effort.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
And so, it's been a huge part of our Hulu program actually also is just not just focusing on access, but focusing on, well, what does it take to actually make this a fantastic launch of a life, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so question number 6, and then after that we'll take a short break, then we'll come back. So question number 6 is, and we're going to return to this notion of data science. In the past 3 years, you led the academic program development for Hawaii's first Bachelor of Science in Data Science. Recruiting an inaugural cohort of 16 students, of whom 13 are Native Hawaiian and 11 are women. So the question is, what is data science? And why is it important to recruit women and Native Hawaiians into this cohort?
Wow. This is a program, again, very near and dear to my heart, very excited about it. And it was, coming to fruition, that took a lot of support from National Science Foundation, again, from Kamehameha Schools. So what is data science? I think data science is the process of turning data, in which the world is currently drowning. We generate data all the time. We're generating a boatload while we're just sitting here, right? Turning that data into actionable knowledge that can make the world a better place. I mean, if that's my personal definition of data science. And that's what I've been trying to sell our students on, that data is power. And if you have data and you can use it to make evidence-based decisions that you can then communicate out to stakeholders, then this can improve the competitiveness of a business. It can improve resource allocation in healthcare. It can tell us what we're going to do when sea level rises. I mean, there are just so many applications if you're interested in sports, it can help you figure out, sports analytics, what's your team
Absolutely.
doing is going to win. I mean, there are so many applications, right? And so, our program is really, the motivation for it really came out of what is the next frontier. We've been producing and supporting young scientists from Hawaii, again, predominantly, students who don't come with a lot of initial privilege, at least. And, we've been generating physicians and environmental scientists and biomedical researchers. And a few years ago, with some help from the National Science Foundation, I think we were able to see that the next kind of edge is data analysts and data managers. What particularly appealed to me about doing data science in Hawaii, so and at Chaminade, so if you look at a lot of universities, the definition of data science as a discipline is what you do with your computer science department.
Right.
It's kind of, it's very transactional. A lot of data science programs have grown out of the statistics and computing departments, and which is all good. 2017, a report came out from the National Academies of Sciences, and it basically asked, what does an undergraduate data science preparation look like? Which I then obviously downloaded and read this with interest,
Right.
And it said such interesting things, Josh. It said that you need, that the coding is a part of it, and the math, of course, that's a key part of it, but it's not all of it, right? That data science is... They sort of said that the purpose of these programs should be to produce, quote, data whisperers, right? People who have the capacity to take data and, again, make it into actionable insights for an organization. And that what that requires is a more generalist way of looking at things, more holistic way of looking at it. So, data science has statisticians and coders. It has people whose specialization is in visualization and the aesthetics of how you communicate data. It has people in it who are more like journalists, data comms people, marketing people. And so I liked that idea because I felt that it was a pretty broad church where a lot of people, a lot of students in Hawaii could find a place within it. And so I think that whole kind of data science thing is a little bit of a misnomer in a way. It's a very, broad program with a lot of different students, whether they're creatives, whether they're quants, whether they're artists, they can find a place in this discipline. Then we took, so we took that report and then we kind of chaminaded it and really added in a whole focus on data integrity, the value system that needs, if data is power, then of course misuse of power is the really very possible. Cambridge Analytica could go on, right?
Right.
And so the National Academies report and our sort of institutional setting really said, okay, we got to drive this in the direction of data ethics, integrity in data management, data sovereignty, who owns data and why. And so, our program is entirely project-based. So every course is a project. There's some fascinating courses in it. In addition to the hardcore coding skills and the visualization skills, they're doing community-engaged computing, where they have to work with a nonprofit or a grassroots organization and help that organization move their mission through data. There's a data journalism course. I teach healthcare informatics. So how is data used to make healthcare decisions, both at the individual but at the population level? So it's an amazing program. The need for having voices in that program from the Hawaiian community and obviously a large proportion of women in that program is quite unusual in computational disciplines. I mean, again, that's all about who has a voice in the decision making, right?
Right.
And I worry about, we've talked a lot about, inequity in STEM and lack of representation. And I feel that without programs making really aggressive efforts to be inclusive in this area of data science, that's when you end up with, 2% of computer scientists being female, those kind of terrible, terrible numbers. And so I feel like we need to really move that. And what I'm seeing in the women in our program is a very strong commitment to they're interested in healthcare problems. They're interested in, we have a whole team of women in our data science program who are working on preterm birth. Right? They're doing internships with Texas Advanced Computing Center,
Wow.
which is in Austin, and they do the internship here because distance doesn't matter anymore with all the tech that you have. And they're working on national data sets that look at maternal mortality and preterm birth and trying to understand
Wow.
why that doesn't hit everybody equally, right? So one of the team is working on that through the lens of the sort of clinical medical side of it. One of them's looking at, is it an access problem? Is it just that people don't have access to healthcare? One team's looking at associations with poverty. And so, so you can sort of see how these amazing sort of questions unfold.
Right.
Very exciting area.
I recall just recently, it was a few months back, that Hawaii Business Magazine published an article by a young woman scientist in which she explained so clearly and in such an articulate way the wisdom of the ancient Hawaiians and the ways that they were scientists in every sense of the word, and talk about excellence in science, and also about using data, which of course, Malama Honua and the Worldwide Voyage, it's all just sort of one. And I was very inspired by that, to see a business magazine carrying an article like that. And I can see that you will be generating graduates who think that they can be published and that their voices can be heard to the general public about what's going on with their education and their hopes and dreams about what they do.
And that it might be more important and more valuable to society. Some of them are going to go off and go up the academic ladder and do what I do and publish papers in journals that no one ever reads, right? But one visualization that you do on Tableau and it goes viral, as long as it's accurate, that can be, like really world changing, right? And so it's kind of tough sometimes as faculty, I think, to understand that the world these students are going to go into is not going to be constrained by the same rules that we have been under as scientists all these years.
Right.
And to your point about the, indigenous persons and traditional culture and how scientific that was. I mean, if you had to live in a resource constrained environment, right, many thousands of miles from anywhere, and you had millennia to observe and connect and understand what was going on, there may not have been the ability to explain at the molecular level sort of what was going on, but how to manage that fish pond was arrived at through a process of evidence, testing, and conclusions that were then passed on. And I mean, that to me is a fairly good definition of the scientific method, right? And so what interests me a little bit right now is this sort of, now that we're rediscovering all of this traditional wisdom and claiming it, right? How do we do that? What does that really mean for science? I do a fair amount of work in my lab in pharmacology, and some of it is looking at compounds and potential drugs that were identified in traditional Chinese or Japanese medicine, again, millennia ago.
Right.
And how can we, maybe it's a smarter strategy to look in those settings for what was defined empirically and then, work from that rather than, try and do drug discovery, which has led to a lot of, broken drug pipelines over the years. So I think, we are at this point where, I mean, thank goodness we're starting to honor that kind of knowledge, and we're starting to sort of rediscover, and somewhere I get uncomfortable is this sort of validation of traditional knowledge. It's like, well, now that a Western scientist in a lab coat says it's good, it's good, right?
It must be good.
I struggle with that a little bit, and not necessarily my kuleana to figure out the answer to that. But I think for our students who are trained, rigorously in a kind of Western reductionist way of doing science in a more holistic kind of system science way, which is, I think, probably more connected to how science was done through indigenous epistemologies. I mean, I think they're going to have to walk in both those worlds, right? And that's something that was interested in talking with them about how they feel about those things and how they're going to navigate that, right?
Right. So Helen, I'm gonna call an audible here, and that's something that's easy to do when you're doing a podcast. So instead of making this one long episode, I'm actually going to break this up into 2 parts. So instead of taking a quick break and then we'll be back right away, I'm going to tell our listeners that we're going to do this in 2 parts. There will be a part 1 and a part 2. So I encourage you, wonderful listeners, to keep a lookout for part 2 of this, which will come out not too long after part 1. And in part 2, we're going to pick up a different, very, very different set of questions, and I'm excited to ask them. So stay with us, stay tuned. Helen, thank you for part 1 of this conversation, and we'll be back soon.
Okay, thank you.